In this session, we'll be doing the first part of certificate enrollment, which obtains a trusted ID cert for use with ISE. As a reminder, currently in place is a self-signed or self-generated certificate that was created at install with ISE, and we're currently seeing the evidence of that by virtue of the trust warning that the Firefox browser is issuing for us. That self-signed cert is being used for other functions in ISE. Let's take a look. If we go to Administration, System, and Certificates, we can see the default self-signed certificate, and if we open this up and look at the details, we'll see, of course, that it's in use for admin, which governs the administrative web pages that we're using right now, but also governs internode communication, where we might have a multiple node deployment. We see also that this self-signed cert is being used for EAP authentication, Radius DTLS, and all the portals that ISE is currently being able to provide, which would include the guest portals. In particular, where we're interacting with end users and end user devices, that trust warning is going to be problematic and not viable for typical production purposes. So we'll want to obtain a trusted ID cert to use with EAP authentication in particular and these portals. Within the lab itself, we've got Microsoft Certificate Services active on the domain controller. Let's go ahead and browse into that now. And the first part of establishing a trusted identity certificate is trusting the signer or the signature on that ID certificate. The signer is the certificate authority, the creator of that certificate, also places their signature on there. We'll want a copy of that signing or CA certificate so that we could validate any received ID certificate, including ISE's own ID certificate that we're about to create here. So we want a copy of the CA certificate first so we can establish that first part of the trust. Let's save this as a file and then go back over to ISE, where we can add to trusted certificates. And we can see that Cisco's placed a good dozen or so existing CA signing authorities. These are used for interaction with Cisco's own web pages for the feed and update services that ISE needs, as well as other resources on the internet. So we'll import our downloaded CA cert, browse for that file. And then we'll add a friendly name to distinguish it a little bit from the rest of those trusted certificates. It's already trusted for authentication within ISE. Additionally, we'll trust this signer for client authentication in syslog and trust it for interaction with Cisco services. And submit. Okay, now we see a copy of our demo.local CA certificate and some brief information, including the validation period. Okay, now that we've trusted our local CA, now we can obtain an ID certificate for ISE and trust that signature that will be placed there. To start that process off, we need to launch a certificate signing request. And these are pretty similar screens for any entity or device that needs to obtain an ID cert, that a CSR needs to be completed for submission to the CA. In this case, ISE informs us what we can use this ID certificate that we're about to obtain for, and some of the certificate authorities that can be applied here. At the drop down here, we see it's already selected for multiple use, letting us know that we can utilize a single ID certificate for multiple purposes. If we do the drop down here, we can see that we can obtain unique ID certs for distinct representations within ISE, including support for ISE to behave as its own certificate authority. Leave that at multi-use, and we'll check the box to allow use of a wildcard certificate Wildcard certificates in a typical environment, very helpful when we'll have multiple nodes and we want to have a single ID cert representing those multiple nodes. And a typical wildcard certificate has an asterisk for the host part of the FQDN. The common name will be automatically populated by the fully qualified domain name on our node that we're submitting this for. And we'll supply the other information here as well. And these values will show in our ultimate received ID certificate, and as we deliver that to entities that need it, they'll be able to view these fields and confirm other specific information within. Within the ID cert that we'll be utilizing, we'll want to have a variety of subject alternative names. Again, this is to help avoid trust issues in interaction with ISE or multiple nodes within ISE. That is, we're interacting that if the name that we are interacting with is also listed as a SAN, that will prevent trust issues as well. For use with a wildcard certificate, where that might be in place, it's helpful to put as a SAN each node that might be utilizing that wildcard cert, so we'll represent that here. Typical application of a wildcard cert will list the wildcard itself as a SAN. Another good DNS name to put in is the pointer record or reverse resolve record that would be within DNS. We may be interacting with the node by IP as opposed to a name. And then to support a Microsoft compatibility issue, interaction with EAP in particular, that it's good to list as a unique SAN value and IP address to prevent the compatibility issue from occurring with Windows workstations. Leave the other values intact. It's an RSA key type. We can modify the key length and the digester or SHA value that we'll want to assign with. These are all pretty standard values, and then we'll generate the CSR. We'll export that so we can save it as a file and use for a subsequent request if needed. In this case, for interaction with Microsoft Certificate Services, we want the actual contents of that CSR, so we'll check it and view it, and we can see the CSR contents on this tab. Select all of those and copy those into our copy buffer. We'll go back over to Microsoft Directory Certificate Services, and go back to the home page and request a certificate. In this case, it will be an advanced certificate request because it will not be for a user. We'll paste in the contents of the CSR, and we'll indicate that we want this certificate to be utilized for web services, and submit. And we'll select base64 encoded for use with ISE and download that cert. It's going to utilize the same name as the CA, but Firefox will prevent the name conflict from being a problem here. And then we'll go back to ISE, and we've got our CSR screen, our pending CSR in place, and now we'll want to bind that ID certificate to that CSR. So we'll browse for the file, and we see that we've got a new cert new. It was relabeled as a 1 and current date there, and we'll open that up, and we'll indicate that we want this cert to be used for admin, and we get a pop-up there indicating that this will cause an application server restart of all nodes that are in the deployment, and we'll see a little bit of downtime as a result. Again, this is going to replace that system internode certificate and of course our portal, administrative portal that we're utilizing here as well. And then we'll submit that. Okay, we get informed that it will restart and log us out of the system, and we'll pick things up with our next section. And just did a little bit of a walkthrough of certificate trust and obtaining an ID cert for use with ISE, and we'll pick things up, as I mentioned, in the next section.